Hello there and welcome to another pyro-seminar. I think this is number 23, so we're kind of, they're mounting up. I guess I've been doing them now for, that would mean almost 2 years. Today I want to revisit actually a talk that I gave in Boise a couple of months ago. I was invited by a university or a student group within the university to participate in a conference on the work of Jordan Peterson. And I was invited partly because I had done a couple of short videos that mentioned Peterson, but I'd never kind of gone that deeply into his work. I just knew of him because I knew that he was making an impact on YouTube and he was becoming a popular public figure. But once I got invited to that conference, I then took time to digest everything. So basically I listened to and looked at everything he did. And also then when I did that, I very quickly saw that one of his major influences is Carl Jung. While Peterson talks about other thinkers, I think sometimes he plays fast and loose with them, sometimes misunderstands, misinterprets them. But when I was reading him, I was like, oh, Peterson seems to have really taken on some Jungian ideas. And so I also then went and delved more into Jung. At the time, I'd only read some of the popular works, but I kind of delved into some of his more important works, particularly volume 7 of his collected works, which is 2 analytic essays on psychology. It's the ego and its relation to the unconscious, and another one. So those are 2 important essays if you're interested in Jung. I think actually if you read those essays, if you read that volume, you kind of get a lot of Jung's main ideas. So it's a good place to start. Anyway, I was invited to Boise. I went and I gave a talk, and my main interest in the talk was to point out that Peterson is not a psychoanalyst. And that was important to me because a few times Peterson has said that. He's talked about being a psychoanalyst. He's also talked about being an existentialist, but we'll leave that for another time. But I thought that was interesting because when I listened to him, I was like, whether you like or dislike psychoanalysis, like, he's not a psychoanalyst. He's not a psychoanalyst in practice because you have to be endorsed by a psychoanalytic institution and you have to do psychoanalytic training, whereas Jordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist. But also in orientation. He is more of a clinical psychologist with an interest in Jung. And what I realized is a lot of people don't know the difference between clinical psychology, psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, counseling, all of these different terms. And so they're all kind of lumped in together. It's like, well, you know, he's a psychoanalyst or he's a clinical psychologist, doesn't make much difference. But that's like me going to some sort of sci-fi convention and saying, oh, you know, Star Wars and Star Trek, they're basically the same, right? I mean, to me, they are basically the same. They both have the word stars in them. They're both set in space. They're both sci-fi. But, you know, to anybody who actually, you know, gets into those things, there's massive difference. Star Trek is set in the future, Star Wars is set in the past. They're completely different characters, they're engaging with different questions, they have a different universe that they're held within. And it's only because I'm not taking an active interest that I think they're both kind of the same. So at that conference, I was trying to draw out why I don't think Peterson is a psychoanalyst in orientation, and also show why that's important in terms of his political understanding and his reading of the contemporary political situation, his critique of progressive politics. So I'm basically going to kind of go over some of that talk here. I've had a little bit of time to reflect on it since I originally gave it, and you know, might want to add a few little bits and pieces here and there. And I just want to take my time and see if we can get somewhere. So we'll start off, jump in by talking about my favourite TV show, which is The Prisoner. The Prisoner was made in the 1960s, and I think you can get it on Netflix. It's well worth watching. It's a very bizarre, surrealist series that charts the life of this super agent, this secret agent, who is in a prison. And this agent is attempting to escape the prison. And each episode is about his attempt to escape the prison and also his attempt to find out who runs it. Now, the background story, which you get in every episode, at the beginning it kind of gives you the preamble of why he's in this prison. It's called the Village. And what happens is this guy's a secret agent working for the British. He resigns for mysterious reasons and he goes back to his house. He packs a trunk, and on top of the trunk you see a picture of some sort of paradise island. So he's obviously trying to get away from everything. He wants to go off to some sort of paradise and leave his work behind. But someone puts a sleeping gas into his house. He falls asleep, and when he wakes up in the Village. Now, the Village isn't a normal type of prison. On the surface, actually, everything seems fantastic. It's beautiful, all your needs are taken care of from when you're born, if you're born in the Village, to when you die. And it's very picturesque. And you can't tell who the prisoners are or who the guards are. And in fact, you get a sense in which the prisoners and the guards are all prisoners in a sense. What else? Oh yeah, of course, the biggest thing is we don't even know who runs the Village. And everybody who is in the Village is given a number, right? So there are no names, it's all numbers. And the main protagonist, who's an actor who was called Patrick McGoogan, fantastic actor, was in some of my other favourite show, Columbo. He was the bad guy in I think one or two of those. Patrick McGoogan, he plays this character and he is number 6. And at the very beginning of every episode, there is a dialogue that you hear. And I'm going to read it to you. This dialogue is between number 2 and number 6. So number 6 is the main protagonist, this spy who's been drugged and brought to this prison. And number 2 is the person who kind of runs the Village. But they're always changing. So every week there's a new number 2. And the number 2, it has phone calls with number 1. And we don't know who number 1 is. Right? Number 1 is the ultimate runner of the Village. And this is the conversation. Where am I? That's number 6. Where am I? In the Village. What do you want? Information. Whose side are you on? That would be telling. We want information. You won't get it. By hook or by crook we will. Who are you? The new number 2. Who is number 1? You're number 6, right? So you get that dialogue at the beginning of every episode and you follow this guy as he tries to figure out who number 1 is and how to escape the Village. I'm not going to tell you who number 1 is now, although I am going to tell you at the very end, right? So there's a spoiler, but it did come out in the 1960s. So if you didn't see it, you had more than enough time, right? But if you don't want to know who number 1 is, don't listen to the end of this seminar. But we're going to return to number 6 at the end. I just want to set that up as the beginning. So first things first, Jordan Peterson. What is his reading of the current political situation? I'm going to try and put it into just a 5-minute summary. Basically for Peterson, Karl Marx, who was one of the towering figures of the 19th century, influenced the 20th century in a profound way. And European academics took on a lot of Marx's work and used it as a way to critique the political economy. But then with the rise of communism in Russia, and particularly with Stalinism, Peterson says that Marxism became untenable as a political and economic critique. So what happened is in the kind of like mid-20th century, academics had to begin to distance themselves from Marxism. And one of the ways they did that was some people just left it entirely, but others took Marxism and began to apply it to other areas. So instead of concentrating on politics and the economy, they started to look at a Marxist analysis of, say, literature, of movies, of gender, of judicial systems, police systems, governmental systems. And this is what Peterson calls the rise of cultural Marxism, that he thinks is associated with the Frankfurt School, which is an important school of thinkers that included people like Lukács and Adorno and Horkheimer. And then what happened is this kind of cultural Marxism gave way or gave rise to postmodernism. And so postmodernism, if it's not synonymous with cultural Marxism for Peterson, it's very connected. With postmodernism, you see the rise of a critique. Now, this is in Peterson's words. If I said where I disagreed with him, I wouldn't get very far, so I'm just giving you his reading. Postmodernism is the rise of relativism. It is a critique of power structures. So within classical Marxism, you have the war of classes, but within postmodernism, you have kind of various other types of conflicts. Basically, the conflict between the powerless and the powerful, and the various ways that that plays out. And then what happens is postmodernism comes over to America. And he's probably thinking of Derrida. Derrida famously did a talk in America that was a critique of a thinker called Lévi-Strauss. And that was part of the taking up of post-structural, postmodern theory in America. And so Peterson sees then the rise of post-structuralism, postmodernism in America happening in the academy. And this movement brings a threat with it. The threat is the destabilization of a very fragile stability within Western civilization. So what you have is, you have within the universities the increase of relativism and cynicism against institutional powers. And this kind of like combination of relativism and profound skepticism or cynicism creates this environment of chaos, and an environment that could threaten to destabilize some of the progress that we have made within the judicial system and governmental systems and democracy, etc. And Peterson will say that democracy is not perfect, Western civilization isn't perfect, but there has been this gradual development and movement that we need to protect against a kind of chaos. And so he sees a lot of progressive politics in relation to, identity politics, etc., as threatening to destabilize a certain order. And he sees his role as partly trying to be a voice for what is being repressed, for what is being destabilized, the other side. So for Peterson, there's basically a type of we're looking for a type of stabilization between positions, between the masculine, the feminine, between, say, order and chaos, or freedom and destiny, or any of the other polarities that we can think of, conscious and unconscious, darkness and light. There are all sorts of polarities. And Peterson's saying we need to find a certain balance between these polarities. They need to communicate with each other. And when one polarity starts to take control and become too big, then it will cause problems and potentially be incredibly destructive. And so the role for Peterson, his role is partly to try to bring balance back by emphasizing what is being held down. So for example, when Peterson says clean your room, right, one of his famous kind of rule, I think it's a rule for life or whatever, is clean your room, take responsibility for things. Peterson himself would admit that is not a universal rule, right? Because obviously that's the worst thing you can say to someone who's an obsessive compulsive, who's got a compulsive neurosis. If someone has a compulsive neurosis, they tidy their room to within an inch of its life, right? Their room looks like nobody lives there. It's completely perfect, right? So what you want to say to someone like that is, you've got to have a bit of dirtiness in your room, a bit of untidiness, right? The truth be told, you don't say that, but what you want to do is you want to get the person to the point that they can tolerate a little bit of messiness. So that's something I think Peterson would definitely affirm, is that tidy your room is simply his attempt to restore a type of balance that he's seeing where chaos begins to reign. Now, From this, I want to jump into Jung, because this is where Jung comes in. You can see the influence of Jung in Peterson's understanding of this notion of complementarity, of balance, of these polarities that we live within, yin yang, basically, right? Masculine, feminine, order and chaos, darkness and light, freedom and destiny, dynamics and form, whatever polarities you want to grab, right? That is a very Jungian way of seeing existence. So for Jung, the unconscious is a compensatory mechanism. That's what he calls it in this volume 7 of this collected works. The unconscious is a compensatory mechanism, which means what the unconscious does is when we emphasize one thing, the unconscious begins to bring up what we are repressing, the other side that we're not looking at. But it comes up in various negative ways. One example he uses, for example, is this guy who thinks really that his brother is nobody, that his brother is an idiot, his brother is a humiliation. But he dreams that his brother is some great general, so he often has these dreams where his brother is Napoleon or something like this, some great hero. What Jung is saying here is that brother has so disparaged his sibling and sees him in such a negative light, but that the other side is erupting in his dreams to try to bring balance to how he sees his brother. And ultimately in that example, Jung says the problem is not how he views his brother, but how he views himself. This guy views himself as amazing, as an incredible person. And so in his dreams, there is a type of attempt to right that by showing that this other person is much better than he is, right? So there's that complementarity. Another example he uses is a young woman who's very close to her mother. So close, can't think of anything bad to say about her, you know. But in her dreams, often her mother appears as a witch. And again, what you see here, it's the opposite. It's that this woman thinks too highly of her mother. Her mother is this idealized other. And so in her dreams, this other side begins to arise. So the unconscious is not doing this through any intentionality, but there is this desire within our being, within our subjectivity, to try to find a type of balance, a harmony between these two positions, to integrate the other side that we are repressing. Again, for Jung, someone who's very masculine, right? Take a guy who doesn't cry, is not emotional, very ordered, etc., etc. It's really playing into a very strong masculine persona, what Jung would call a persona. The feminine dimension will be at work for Jung in that person, but it's being disavowed, it's being repressed, it's being pushed down, and so it will erupt. And it will erupt, says Jung, in maybe outbursts of tears, where the guy will just break down one day, not be able to cope, or it'll come out in outbursts of anger and irrationality. It will come out in unhealthy ways, but that is the attempt to kind of return the repressed back up to consciousness. And it's the same for the feminine. Someone who is, playing into a very feminine persona, they will be repressing the masculine dimension, and that will erupt in various ways. Some of the ways that Jung talks about this probably strike us a little bit odd now, but that's basically the idea. And for Jung, there's basically three ways. There's kind of two unhealthy ways and one healthy way where this unconscious erupts. The most unhealthy way is when there's a part of your psyche that is broken off from the rest of you, completely broken off. It will appear in reality. And of course, he's thinking here about psychosis, right? Where a disavowed part of yourself, a broken off part of your own psyche, appears in reality itself. I mean, a simple example of that is a child who has an imaginary friend, right? There is a friend, someone who he or she is talking to in the room, who is outside of themselves, who is really a disavowed part of themselves. And That's something you see in many adults. You see it happening a lot at various times in history. But, there's an easy example of it as an imaginary friend. And the next level, which is less bad than that, because that's pretty extreme, whenever you're so cut off from a dimension of yourself that it actually appears in reality. And that happens for many people, where they even imagine there is a murderer upstairs in the living room. Like there is literally something appearing in reality itself. It's not inside you at all, it is in reality. There is somebody walking around in your living room. But the next stage is where the cut off part of your psyche isn't in the world out there. It's within you, but it's also separate from you. It's within you, but not fully integrated. So it erupts in various symptoms. As I say, explosions of anger, or someone who's incredibly opinionated for no reason, or whatever it is. Something arises that is within you. You don't think it's out in the real world, but you think it's a stranger. You're like, oh, that's not me. That outburst of anger, that's not who I really am. Oh, those tears, I don't know what came over me. No, that's not who I am. So you see how it's in you, but you distance yourself from it. And then the third, which is the healthy place, is when you're so integrated with that part of yourself that it's not some sort of personality that's out in the world, or some sort of personality that is within you erupting at times, but it is just a part of you. You're able to converse with it. This is I enjoy reading Jung, actually. I think he's a deeply insightful person. And while I disagree with some of his fundamental principles, I think he has some incredible insights. And one of the interesting things he says about this experience of another within you is he encourages you to have a conversation with it. And I think that's very helpful advice, is that you treat it as a personality. So if you're very masculine and you're repressing the feminine, you try to, in a way, treat that part of yourself as a personality, and you ask, what is it that you want? What is it that you're saying to me? What is it that you would like to change in my life? And you enter into a dialogue with that part of yourself. And as you enter into a dialogue with it, you can begin to integrate it more into your sense of self. I think that is useful advice for some people, is to try to treat your symptom as a personality. And Jung himself says it's not a personality. A lot of people find Jung very New Agey and stuff like that, but Jung, while he'll use a lot of mythological language, he is very clear at times in saying, it's not this anima, which is the name for the feminine unconscious part of the masculine, and animus is the name for the masculine unconscious dimension of the female. So the anima and the animus aren't personalities, they aren't things, but you can treat them as personalities. They appear as personalities, and if you want to integrate them into your life, you should talk to them. So within Jung, you have this notion of complementarity, of two sides that need to be in conversation in order to bring health and healing and wholeness. Another thing just to mention that's important for a basic understanding of Jung is his notion of the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious is stuff that's happened to you with your family, with your friends, in your history, that you have put out of your mind, that you have repressed in various ways. So they are singular to your experience. But Jung says that there is a collective unconscious as well. And the collective unconscious brings us into contact with more primordial archetypes that existed before we were born and will exist after we're dead. That our mind shares something with the past and with the future. And he says that actually in religious terms this is sometimes called the soul, because the soul is the name that's given to some aspect of me that I feel is eternal, that is me but also is not me. You die physically, but your soul rises up. So the soul is this weird thing that is both intimately who I am and yet not connected necessarily with, with my hand, or I could cut off my hand, I haven't lost a part of my soul, right? It's not connected with the body. And Jung says that actually this notion of the soul, which you find in different ways in different cultures and communities, is potentially the collective unconscious, because the collective unconscious is a deep part of you. It's more you than you yourself, but it also transcends you. It existed before you were there and will exist after you're gone. And so the religious notion of the soul is for Jung is a psychological way of describing this dimension. And again, Jung doesn't want to say that's just what it is. He says, well, there might be more to the religious soul, but he says that the collective unconscious has this eternal dimension to it. And the collective unconscious has these very basic archetypes of your father or mother or child or wisdom teacher, whatever it is. And when you enter into the world, various concrete people take on those roles in your life. So there's a concrete father, concrete mother, but the only way that you can relate to them as a father and as a mother is because in a deep way that is already within you. Those rules in a very abstract way are already embedded within our minds to be taken up in the concrete world. And what happens for Jung is as you are able to converse with your personal unconscious, as you're able to converse with the repressed parts of your life, your relationship with your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, your friends, whoever it is, and make space for that and integrate it. The more balance you find there, the more you will see the collective unconscious, the more it's almost like your personal unconscious is superimposed on the collective unconscious. But as you begin to integrate and become comfortable with your own personal unconscious, which is a never-ending task, you start to glimpse the collective unconscious. And for Jung, this is important because this actually gets you beyond your own personal interests. When you connect with the collective unconscious, you become less of an egotist, a narcissist. You care less about yourself and you connect with something that connects with all of us. You become interested in larger issues of society and of politics, etc., and your affirmation of life widens and deepens. So that's kind of the collective unconscious, and the royal road to the collective unconscious is mythology. And this is why you'll notice with Peterson, it's like the majority of his work, like at least online, seems to be his interest in reading religious texts, particularly the Bible, right? He's got over 30 hours of lectures that he's giving, and he wants to continue to give these lectures, which are very long, drawn out, very close kind of reflections on biblical stories. Like these lectures range from an hour and a half to 2 hours generally. And it's very important to go like, why is he interested in that? Because he's not trying to argue for the existence of God. God doesn't come into this. He's interested in doing readings of these stories, but without kind of getting into some sort of apologetics. And while Peterson might believe in God, you get these elements in his work where he hints at maybe he thinks that something does underlie or ground these archetypes. That's not of any interest to him. When he's doing his talks on religion, he has no interest in whether you're a theist or an atheist. So what's going on there? And this is one of the big places where he really does go in a different direction to new atheism. Because for new atheists, these mythologies are pointless, mostly, or even dangerous. You won't get someone like Sam Harris spending 30 hours reading the Bible. What is Peterson doing? Well, for Peterson as a Jungian, he's saying that one of the best ways to encounter the collective unconscious is through the mythologies that have been passed down through the eons, the mythologies that still subjectively grasp us, that still make an impact on us. These stories, that if we wrestle with them, not just passively look at them or listen to them, but if we actually enter into them, can help us connect with those disavowed parts of ourselves, those things that we are not connecting with. They'll come up not in unhealthy ways, but in healthy ways. And that's why you see Peterson just spending time trying to get the audience to enter into the stories of the biblical text, to walk around them, to feel them from the inside, in order to connect with this collective unconscious. And you don't connect with the collective unconscious by going out into the world. You do it, as you've heard me say, but by going deeper within. So another example concretely from Jung, he talks about a young woman who's a philosopher, maybe a philosophy student, not sure, but she had a troubled relationship with her father. And so she goes to therapy primarily to work out that troubled relationship. And her study of philosophy is connected with that troubled relationship as well. And what happens, which is what happens in therapy generally for neurotics, is eventually Jung becomes a type of, through transference, a father figure for this young woman. So at first there's the father, the real father that she has a problem with. And then there is Jung, who becomes a stand-in for that father and maybe becomes a healthier view of what a father is, doesn't treat her in the same way. And one of the ways this happens is she has dreams where Jung is a father-like figure. He is larger than life. He's holding her hand like she's a little child. He's on a mountaintop, I think, at one point, and there are winds flying around them both. And in this dream, what you see is that Jung has become a type of father figure for her. And then what Jung says here is, okay, so what happens next? How does the transference end? What is the cure? And he says that through analysis, they come to see the wind that is in these dreams as a type of God. And so what happens is they move from the concrete father that this woman has to a more abstracted father, which is the role that Jung plays for her. And then finally to a kind of father figure that's an archetype, that's deep down. So she connects then with this God-like archetype, this fatherly, God-like archetype. And that is the end of the analysis, right? That is the cure. As she connects in a healthy way with this archetype, she is a more integrated individual. So again, what Peterson is doing here is he's not arguing for some God out there in the world. What he is saying is that we have a God concept, and we have these archetypes, these hero archetypes that are within, that get covered over. And religious stories, religious mythologies can help us encounter them and enter into a relationship with them. And when we do that, we re-establish order between, or a balance between order and chaos, between high and low, between darkness and light. Okay, let's look at my notes, see where we're at. This is why, by the way, you'll notice that Peterson's reading of the Bible is very self-helpy. I mean, everything about it is about how to, he used a lot of concrete examples about people like a chef who gets a promotion after listening to Peterson's work, or managers who are able to work more productively as a result of working with Peterson. But there's it's a very self-help reading of the biblical text, because that's what he sees it doing, it's re-establishing a harmony and an order. And that if we disconnect from these stories and mythologies, we will find ourselves hurtling towards destruction. And say that's one of the things he disagrees with the new atheists. He says, no, we need to get to the truth of these myths, and the truth isn't an apologetic argument for the existence of God, but rather an internal connection with a disavowed, unconscious archetypes. Let's see. Yeah, just on the idea of the self-help thing, but it's interesting because at one point in Peterson's lectures, he says that he's an existentialist, that he does an existential reading of the Bible. But it's not. I think maybe he's just misusing the term. Like, he thinks existential means he's doing a reading of the text that impacts a person. But that's what everybody's trying to do. But an existential reading of the text is the opposite of what Peterson's talking about. The ultimate existential reading of the Bible, of course, is Søren Kierkegaard. And Søren Kierkegaard, his whole point is to say that the Bible is not a type of Gnostic or pagan bringing balance and order, but rather is fundamentally destabilizing. So his reading of Abraham and Isaac, for example, is, for Peterson, it's a wisdom teaching, and for Kierkegaard, it is the rupture of reason. It is the rupture of wisdom, a fundamentally destabilizing force. Now, I will do a lecture sometime on Kierkegaard and existentialism, but that's not what we're doing here. I just thought I'd mention it. Because an interesting example is, one thing that Peterson says is that he's worked with managers who try to work, to be very productive. They're obsessed with work and they can't sleep. They can't spend time with their kids. They find it hard to spend time with their families, right? And Peterson says one of the techniques he uses is that he tries to show these managers that actually, if they want to be productive, more productive, they should value sleep and they should value time with their family, because there are studies that show that if you're well rested and if you spend time with your family and your friends, you will actually be more productive. And Peterson says he has seen a lot of success in working with managers who are able then to embrace sleep and time with their families, seeing that it actually makes them more productive within the contemporary, economic system. But that's kind of strange, because from a psychoanalytic reading of that, I think would be generally a little bit different, which would see the problem being that they are so obsessed with the accumulation of capital and working harder and harder and harder. And that the sleep is not, the lack of sleep, the inability to sleep, the insomnia is not something to be overcome by helping them be even better at making more money, but actually is a protest that needs to be listened to. That maybe what they need to do is destabilize and rethink the very nature of what they think is valuable and good, and maybe work less hard. But anyway, that's beside the point. Now, this is where I want to start making a distinction between Jung and Freud, or what I want to call depth psychology or analytic psychology and psychoanalysis. So hopefully the main thing for you to remember now, because we've covered a lot, is simply that Jung has a notion of the unconscious as a compensatory mechanism that brings up to the surface what you're repressing to try to bring order and balance. But when we don't listen to the unconscious, when we close our ears to it, that eruption is destructive, is negative, it comes in all sorts of bad forms. But if we are able to listen to it, to speak to it, to even argue with it, because that's the big thing. Whenever Jung says that you treat the anima or the animus, the masculine side or the feminine side of the masculine, whenever you treat it as a personality, you listen to it, you ask what it wants of you, but you don't just passively listen, then you respond to it, then you enter into an argument with it, you go back and forth with it, and it's actually this dynamic interaction with the disavowed that's the successful thing. It's not passively watching it. At one point Jung talks about how that's not successful at all. If you just passively observe these parts of yourself, that often doesn't have any value. It can have some value, but often doesn't really bring healing. So you engage with it. So you've got this compensatory mechanism. The unconscious brings up what's being repressed. If it's not done in a healthy way, it'll be unhealthy, which connects, by the way, with Peterson's analysis of contemporary political situation, is that progressive politics is this this unhealthy imbalance that is destabilizing the West. And so he needs to through his teaching of the Bible and these biblical stories, bring up the order and the hierarchy and the cleanliness and all of this type of stuff to try to bring balance back. And he sees that as his job. There's one very bizarre point in his lectures, if you've listened to them, where he stops and he tells everybody about a dream that he's had. And in this dream, God calls Jordan Peterson up to heaven, and he is standing in this great amphitheater, and he has to fight the devil, and he's fighting the devil. Eventually he succeeds and he kills the devil, and then he goes up to God and he's angry at God. He's like, God, why would you have me fight the devil? And God looks at him and smiles and says, because I know that you're able to defeat the devil. Right now, so at first it might sound weird. Why is Peterson sharing this dream that doesn't put him in a very good light? It's a very megalomaniac. He is the servant of God, fighting not people who are misguided even or wrong, but fighting the devil himself. But again, thinking about it from a Jungian perspective, Jung spent time in Central Africa with a tribe in this forest called, I forget the name, the Elgon Forest or something, but this tribal group, and they talked about little dreams and big dreams. Little dreams are, for Jung, connected with the personal unconscious. They are dreams that would be boring to anybody else. They're just your dreams that relate to your personal neuroses. But then you have big dreams. And big dreams have to be shared with everybody, because big dreams are your connection with the collective unconscious. They are your connection with wider issues of the world that potentially affect everybody. And so whenever you hear Peterson talk about this dream, or when he reads a letter out from a woman who sees Peterson as a messenger of God, he's seeing this as he is connected to his collective unconscious and the collective unconscious, and that is his mission, and that he is now integrated enough that his job and role in the world is to fight this radical destabilization that is occurring in the world through bringing up the other side. So that's Jung's notion of the unconscious. Of course, as well, I mentioned that there's the personal unconscious, the collective unconscious, the archetypes, all of that. So why does this differ from Freud? Why is this not psychoanalysis? Well, first of all, Jung doesn't call himself a psychoanalyst. Jung eventually came to the term analytic psychologist. And of course, there was very famously a split between Freud and Jung. And the split was because Jung, in a sense, went away from psychoanalysis and started to do something else. So what is it that Jung is doing? And one way of describing it is the term depth psychology. Depth psychology is the term that is given to anything that takes seriously the unconscious. So any type of psychological framework that takes seriously the idea that an unconscious is at work could be maybe called a depth psychology. But the issue is with depth psychology, generally that means the unconscious is a thing that is within us. It is a subterranean world. You'll hear people sometimes use the term subconscious, right? It's something that's under, beneath, a subterranean reality that is like the conscious, but it's just hidden, doesn't have intentionality, but it has substance. And so you have people who maybe are depth psychologists but aren't psychoanalysts, people like Jung, Frankl, Carl Rogers, for example. All very interesting thinkers, but they're different from psychoanalysts who are people like Anna Freud, Winnicott, Bion, Lacan, right? And the difference is this. We've touched on this in a previous seminar when I looked at Zizek, is that for Freud, the central insight of psychoanalysis is that the unconscious doesn't exist. The unconscious isn't another thing. There isn't a compensatory mechanism that the unconscious is there to kind of bring some sort of balance and order and harmony. The unconscious is a split within subjectivity itself. It is what makes us not at one with ourselves. So the example I think I used in the previous seminar, but I like it, so I'm going to use it again, is in Northern Ireland, there was a city, it still is a city, that has two names. And during the Troubles, depending on how you named the city, it told everybody else what your political background was, how you grew up, whether you were a Republican or a Unionist, or a Loyalist, sorry, or whether you were Catholic or Protestant, right? The very way that you named the city said something, and it was called Londonderry or Derry. So if you called it Londonderry, it showed that you grew up in a more unionist environment, and if you called it Derry, you grew up in a more nationalist environment. And this is very, very difficult because there was no neutral way of saying what the city was. If somebody wanted to find out, what political position you were coming from, they could just ask you to name the city, and then you're stuck. You're like, well, what do I say? And what happened is in the media, people started to say Derry stroke Londonderry as a way of kind of covering all bases. And eventually there was a radio host guy called Jerry Anderson, very funny guy, but he started to call it Stroke City. So there was Derry or Londonderry, and then the official name became Derry stroke Londonderry, and then he's called it Stroke City, which is just naming the stroke itself. Now what's interesting is that there were not two cities, there's obviously only one city, and that gap doesn't exist in reality. It's just a gap that exists within language. But depending on what side of the political divide you're on, you saw the city in a very different way. There's one city, but different people had very different understandings of how the city was organized, where it's safe to go, where it's unsafe to go, where to go, where you send your kids to school, etc., etc. One city, but cut between Derry and Londonderry. And these are not, if you'll notice, they're not two compensatory things. It's not that you can find some balance between the two of them. It's what fundamentally makes any sort of balance impossible. Now, the only thing you can do in this situation is find what can be called a compromise formation, which is to find a way where both sides are unhappy, but happy with their unhappiness, right? You can't find a way to kind of solve you're either, in Northern Ireland, either Northern Ireland's part of the rest of Ireland, it's a united Ireland, or it's part of the United Kingdom, right? You can't really find a way of balancing those two positions, of having them together. But what we had to do is find a way to create a compromise formation in which all of us had to lay down certain things and struggle, and none of us were overly happy. But because nobody's overly happy, all of us were able to eventually, in order to stop the suffering, move forward together. And that is the Freudian unconscious. The Freudian unconscious is not a thing that you can find. It's not a thing that can be balanced with the consciousness. It is like a black hole that disturbs matter. Like there's matter and then there's a black hole. The black hole isn't something, it is a gap that distorts how light operates and where it goes. That's the unconscious. Now then, why is that important? It's important because Jung basically, this is why I would call Jung a conservative and Peterson a conservative, is the conservative view at its most basic is the view that there is a harmony and a peace and a balance that we can have in our own individual lives, in religion, in politics, whatever. Now, the conservative view of that is that lies in the past. An original blessing. There was some time in the past when things were good, and now there's a disharmony, but we have to get back to the way things were. And on a personal level, that might be you think about a relationship that you think is perfect, was good, and you're like, oh, I just want to get back to that. Or you think childhood. We think that childhood is this idyllic time, or a golden era in the history of America. That was where things worked, where there was stability and there were balance, and people knew their place. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. Right? That verse from All Things Bright and Beautiful. So that there is a move to go. There is a stability that we can have, and it lies in the past. And then revolutionaries are there is a stability that we can have and it lies in the future. It's something we have to fight for. It's something that we need to grasp that is ahead of us. So one is eschatological and one is kind of what you could call it ancestral, right? One goes back and one goes forward. And Freud basically is saying that no, that's the problem. The problem is thinking that there is some sort of stability and harmony that we can have. That's actually how our kind of economic system works. This weird idea that if we have enough money, if we work hard enough, if we have enough fame, if we look the right way, if we do this or that, we do the right self-help, we take the right drugs, we do the right meditation, everything will be good. We will find some sort of harmony. Within a psychoanalytic frame, it is that fantasy that actually causes so much agony and misery, unhappiness. It also is what basically we spend our energy trying to get, which then benefits other people, because you're so pursuing this that you're and maybe you're watching Keeping Up with the Kardashians or something, and you're seeing their life as this perfect thing and you want it, and just you watching that show and buying into that fantasy is actually creating lots of revenue for lots of people, right? So we are batteries libidinally invested in this pursuit of a stability and a wholeness and a completeness. And so the difference between Jung and Freud, and you could maybe talk about a conservative Jung and a liberal Jung. A conservative Jungian is looking to the past, and maybe a liberal Jungian is looking to the future, but it's the idea of a balance, a stability and a harmony. But for Freud, you can't have that, because the unconscious isn't a compensatory mechanism. It is a cut that distorts, that creates, that we are basically a mix of contradictory desires and wants and fears that don't fit together. And that actually what it brings healing is that we come to converse with those conflictual aspects of ourselves. We learn to create healthy compensatory mechanisms. We come to terms with the reality that life is struggle. In fact, we come to enjoy the fact that life is struggle. So if you want to put it in religious terms, you could say conservatives have an idea that there is this heaven and only some people get into it. So it's a universal, as in everybody should hear the message about heaven, but only some people get in. And the liberals say, well, it's a universal in the sense of everybody should hear about it, but everybody gets in. And the radical move is the one that says, no, the point is not to get into heaven, but to get the absolute out of heaven into the struggle of the earth. In other words, some people say only a few people get to the table. And then someone says, no, everybody gets to the table. And then the third position is, no, we have to overturn the tables. There's something fundamentally wrong about the way we structure reality itself, the way we're thinking about it. So from a Freudian perspective, what that means is that we learn to enjoy struggle, and we don't give ourselves over to this fantasy of wholeness and completeness, which actually creates the very problems it promises to fix. I'll give you a concrete example. This is a true example of somebody I know who was a psychologist and was working with a kid. The kid was brought to him because the kid was bedwetting. And I don't know what age the child was, but he was old enough that they thought this was a problem. He wasn't able to get over it. And the parents brought the child to this psychologist, this clinical psychologist, to say, can you use some cognitive therapies in order to kind of help this kid stop wetting the bed? Now, the parents saw the bedwetting as a threat to the balance and stability of the family. The bedwetting was threatening to destabilize this family unit, right? It was a problem that was entering into this balance, this relative balance within the family. And he admitted to me, he said, like, as a clinical psychologist, that's the way he thought about it for a while. And he tried to work with the child, doing cognitive therapies to try to get the kid to overcome bedwetting. But then he said he realized that there was something wider at work here, that actually the bedwetting wasn't the problem. It was the solution to a problem. It was a symptom. It wasn't a problem, it was a symptom. And the difference is this. He was like, oh, the bedwetting isn't what is threatening to destabilize the harmony of the family unit. The bedwetting is the materialization of a disavowed disharmony that already exists within the family, right? And that's very important. That's really key. So it's like the bedwetting is the concrete material manifestation of a disavowed disharmony that already exists within the family, which means for the clinical psychologist here, he says, I can't work with the bedwetting. I have to work with the family. And when we actually bring up the disharmony and the problems that are within the family, maybe as we bring that up, the bedwetting will stop. And he discovered that that was in fact the case. When he brought the family unit together to start to talk about what was going on in the family, he discovered that the parents had all sorts of resentments and hidden dimensions that weren't being talked about in the family, that they were in conflict, but they were trying to disavow it. They were trying to pretend that there was no conflict, that everything was fine. And when that was brought up to the surface, the bedwetting stopped. Not because they found a new stability, but they found a way to navigate it. They had to make compromises with each other. They had to tell each other difficult truths, and they had to find a new way of relating. And it was only as they gave up the ideal of a type of marriage they had in their head, which was a type of Jungian marriage, you know, the unification of two opposites, bringing this balance and stability, like that mythology of love, that two people incomplete making themselves complete. It was that very fantasy that was causing the bedwetting. And when they let go of that and they realized that we are two desiring subjects who have various contradictory desires within us and between us, and we have to navigate those, and in fact we can affirm those and even enjoy them and think that that's what makes life interesting. As they were able to make space for that, they were able to improve their marriage, and the symptom dried up, for want of a better word, right? So going back then to the prisoner at the very start of this talk, what has this got to do with everything? Well, I'm saying that Peterson's issue is that he sees progressive politics as a problem, as an external enemy threatening a relative stability. But from a psychoanalytic perspective, you could say that perhaps it is a symptom that is a material cry that reflects a problem within our current system. But the problem is this: the cry is not a cry to overturn the system, to overturn the table, but rather to say, hey, we should all get to the table, right? So big corporations put in sleep rooms or transgender bathrooms or whatever into their workplace. In other words, the system continues to run. It just tries to expand who gets in. Now more people can participate. When the radical move is to go, no, it's not about getting more people into the system. Maybe there's something that's wrong with the system itself and we need to rethink it from the ground up. And this is what you see in The Prisoner, right? In The Prisoner, this dialogue, shall I see if I can remember, it says, who are you? I am number two. Where am I? In the village. What do you want? We want information, right? And he goes on to say, who is number one? And then the guy says, you're number six, right? This dialogue. The truth is, what we find in the very last episode is we find out who number one is. And it's very interesting, right? It's a very surrealist type of show, so it's a bit strange at first. But what happens is number six rips off this mask of number one and eventually looks, and it's himself. And you realize that they told you the answer every episode, right? Every episode it told you who number one is. It's like, who are you? I am number two. Who is number one? You are number six. What you find is that actually the protest against the system is actually part of the system itself. It's what the system requires in order to keep running. It's actually generated by the system and it's part of the system's mechanism. An example I've used before, but you're watching something like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, watching it ironically, watching it while laughing at it is actually continuing to keep it on air, because you're watching it is feeding it libidinally. So as soon as, viewing figures don't care about whether you're watching ironically or not ironically, they just care that you're watching. So the attack on the very system is part of what keeps the system going. And in The Prisoner, it's only when he realizes this, it's only when he realizes that he is part of the problem, that he is the problem, that he is able to escape. And we remember that at the very beginning of every episode, you see him with his picture of Paradise Island, wanting to get to that place of pure perfection. And it's what he realizes is that very fantasy itself that keeps him entrapped within the system. That, I think, is a good way of thinking about the difference between a Jungian reading of the political situation, where a lot of the outcry against capitalism today is seen as a problem that is destabilizing Western civilization, to a Freudian notion of it's a symptom that is actually expressing a disavowed disharmony within the system that needs to be addressed and needs to be looked at. Okay, so there you go. I hope that kind of overview gave you a little bit of a sense of at least Jung, why I think that Peterson is a very Jungian thinker, why I think Jung is a conservative thinker ultimately, and why he differs from Freud.